In this video, we'll show you a few of the methods we use to patch up the drywall in this room. In case you're new here, my name's Dan and I love to DIY things. Like this entry table, this pantry floor, and even this 1949 Spartan Manor camper trailer. So in this video, I helped my big brother Steve repair one of his rooms, and I'll show you the 4 different methods we use to repair different size holes in those walls. Let's get to it. So some drywall basics. This side is the front, and this is the back. Drywall panels come in different thicknesses. This one is 1/2 inch, but you can go from 1/4 inch up to 5/8 of an inch. And we knew what thickness of new drywall to buy because we measured the thickness of the existing drywall in one of these holes. For each of these repair methods that we'll show you, they all start a bit differently, but they usually end up with joint tape and then joint compound to blend it in with the existing wall. So we'll show the joint tape and the joint compound or mudding phases at the end of this video. For this wall with all the damage on it, we decided to just replace a whole big section. So we started off by finding the studs on either edge of the damaged areas, marked them with a pencil, and found that it was 48 inches from stud to stud, which is to be expected because studs are typically spaced 16 inches on center. Then we measured vertically and saw that we wanted to make the piece just over 5 feet long. We measured that length on the new piece of drywall, traced the line, scored it with a box knife, snapped it, then cut the paper on the opposite side. Okay. While I held the piece between the markings for the studs, my big brother Steve made sure that it was level and then traced the outline. From there, we used saws to cut to the edges of the studs, while being mindful of the fact that there could very well be electrical lines behind this wall. Once we find a stud, it's a simple matter of following it down the length of the cut. Steve is just using a random thin saw here, but they do make drywall saws that look a lot more like this one I'm using, but typically have even coarser teeth that don't get clogged up by the dust of the drywall. The drywall saws are really handy because they're pointed, and you can press them into the drywall to start any cut. You can see here that this piece we're removing spans a couple studs, and we really should have been wearing masks at this point because it was pretty dusty. With the drywall gone, we went back and removed any remaining drywall screws and pried out any remaining nails. Since there's no wood on the edges of this new hole to attach the new drywall to, I'm cutting this 2x4.5 with a little battery powered saw that wasn't quite up to the task. So I had to finish the job with a handsaw. Next, I marked out how long I want the piece to be, cut it off camera, and then maneuvered it into the wall. And that will work perfectly. Next, I made a series of holes with a diameter greater than that of the screws we'll use to attach this to the stud. Then, as I held the board in position against the stud, I secured it with several screws. We repeated the exact same process for the other side of the hole. Holding up the new drywall shows that it actually wants to go to the center of the already existing studs. So in this case, it's a little bit too wide for us. So we measured it off a couple inches, scored it, snapped it, and cut it off. Theoretically, we could have used our little hand saws to cut halfway across the width of the outer studs, but that would have taken a lot of time and effort, and it was much easier to cut this piece of drywall a bit narrower. And in the next section, you'll see that with the right tool, you can actually cut down the center of the studs pretty easily. Once we got the new piece to fit in there well, that required shaving off some of the bumps that remained when we snapped off that extra bit of width. We decided to clean up and try and make a bevel on the existing drywall so that the tape can cover it more easily. And at this point, it's really handy to mark the location of the studs on the existing drywall so you can better locate the screws when you're securing the new piece of drywall. Second hit.
Nope. I want to see that one in the video.
So here's Steve's holding a straight piece of drywall to help me actually hit the stud.
Did that one go in?
It hit wood, but then I went too far. No, I went too far into the drywall. You can buy special driver bits for putting screws into drywall that will stop it at the perfect depth. But if you're like me and don't have one of those, you have to be really careful not to drive them in too far, because then it doesn't really hold the drywall very well. So that's not far enough. That's just right. And this is driven in too far. For some reason, we had a bit of a gap up top, So I jammed in a piece of the drywall sideways and cut off the excess with the flat saw. And that filled it in quite nicely. For this repair, Steve is measuring off a horizontal line to guide his cut between the studs. Then he remembered he had this oscillating tool and used it to cut it roughly along the edge of the stud. With the bulk of the drywall removed, it's then easy to draw a line in the center of the stud to cut along with the oscillating tool. And again, we should have been wearing some masks. But that tool makes it so much easier, isn't it? This, of course, allowed us to cut a piece of drywall that could span the studs and be secured on either side without the addition of extra pieces of wood. This is a very easy option if you have such a tool. Then you can simply secure the new piece of drywall with some screws. Here I'm driving a couple extra screws into the existing drywall because it seemed like it was popping up off the stud a little bit. I saw this cool repair technique somewhere online. Take an appropriately sized piece of drywall, whether it's a new or old piece, like we're using in this case, and score lines about 1 to 1.5 inches in from each edge. Then snap it along each score line. Then peel away that drywall from the other paper facing. This should leave you with a piece of drywall with a nice paper border around it. Since the drywall often doesn't snap very cleanly, I'm using this razor blade to clean up and straighten the edges. Then I position this patch over the hole and trace the outline of the drywall onto the wall. This then shows us exactly what we need to cut out. And now that piece of drywall should fit really well into the hole you just made. Since this method doesn't use joint tape, I'll show you how we use some joint compound or mud to secure it into the hole. Here I'm using this taping knife to put a layer of mud along the edge of the drywall we'll be inserting into the wall, and then spreading some on the backside of that paper surrounding the drywall patch. Then I simply pressed it in while trying to keep that face flush with the wall, and squeezed out any excess joint compound from the paper. From this point, we can mud it just like any of the other patches. Another method we used was this mesh wall repair patch. This is basically a metal mesh with some kind of fiber mesh on top of it that you can stick to the wall and then cover with this heavyweight spackling. If you're at all concerned about sound transmission between rooms, this option may not be the best because it doesn't put that much more mass into the wall. Instead, you might want to use one of the other techniques where you're actually putting more drywall and thus sound dampening mass into the wall. This particular spackle goes from pink to white as it dries, and in my opinion, you'd still want to sand this and apply a couple layers of joint compound or mud so that you can really blend it in with the wall. Here on the left, you can see one of these patches that's dried going from pink to white. For the joint tape, I really prefer this stuff that has a bunch of holes in it and it is peel and stick, because anytime I've used the solid joint tape, it tends to get bubbles in it and just does not look very good at all. As a DIYer, I find this kind much easier to work with. And you can see I'm applying some extra pieces on some smaller holes nearby. I can only find this kind at Lowe's, but Home Depot had this mesh kind, which will probably work just as well. This is the all-purpose joint compound or drywall mud that we're using for our repairs. With this particular type of joint tape, I like to try and work in as much mud as I can between the two pieces of drywall and then smooth it out. So you can see I'm just working down the piece of tape, first pushing the mud into the joint and then spreading it out. Push and spread. And for this first layer of mud, I'm really just concerned with covering up that joint tape and not doing too thick of a layer on the first go. And then of course covering up any screw heads. Okay, hopefully that's a good first layer. We of course repeated this process for our other patches, including the one that went stud to stud, and this type that didn't require any joint tape. After we let that first layer of mud dry for a day, as it states in the instructions, we came back and sanded it all smooth. Then we came back with some more joint compound and an even wider taping knife as the second step in minimizing the transition between the old drywall, the tape, and the new drywall. Basically, we're trying to make a really long ramp between the old drywall to the tape and the tape to the new drywall. ideally so gradual that you wouldn't notice it with the naked eye. And that can often take a third coat, still with sanding smooth between layers, using an even wider taping knife. Mudding is definitely a skill, and by the third day and the third layer, I was feeling fairly handy with the taping knife. Don't be worried about going over the same areas multiple times to try and get it smooth. I did find it helpful to put more pressure on the edge of the tape knife that is furthest from the patch. And here are the results of our handiwork after 3 days of applying joint compound. After all the mud dried, Steve sanded it once again and then sprayed several cans of this wall texture on all the patches to make it blend in with the existing walls, and then covered up the bold colors on those walls with a couple layers of paint. And look how good it looks now. And if you like videos like this, you might like this one here.